Hi everyone, it's Kalila Brown-Dean. Today we're turning over this hour of Disrupted for a special from New Hampshire Public Radio. Their Civics 101 podcast is a guide to how elections work. To learn more about it, you can visit civics101podcast.org. We'll be back with new episodes of Disrupted in September. Thanks for listening.
And that's New Hampshire's Public Radio's Civic 101 podcast. And these are its co-hosts and producers, Hannah McCarthy and Nick Capodice. Thank you so much for being with us here this morning.
It was a pleasure to be here, Jesse. Thank you.
Thank you. Do you remember this?
Oh, yeah. I remember this.
You want to just tell everyone real quick what it was?
Yeah, sure. In November of 2021, Nick and I were on Washington Journal on C-SPAN talking about our show. And I remember very clearly, Nick, when they opened the phone lines.
Let's talk to James, who's calling from Port Angeles, Washington. James, good morning.
Good morning, Jesse. Are you guys there?
We're here. Go ahead, James.
Yeah. Being bipartisan, you guys from New Hampshire, how do you keep your own opinions to yourselves on your show? I know you're just working on one subject.
And I want to play one caller's specific beef with us, and he's not alone.
Let's talk to Murph, who's calling from Germantown, Tennessee. Murph, good morning.
Thank you for taking this call. I have a bone to pick with your two guests. I taught American government and civics for 22 years in the American public school classroom in Tennessee. The United States of America is not a democracy. Never has been, never will be. It is a republic, and we pass laws and govern ourselves through our elected representatives and a rule of law. If you want to investigate a democracy, I suggest you look at the Democratic Republic of the Congo or the former Soviet Union, who allowed people to vote, but they only had one choice. I find your efforts outstanding because of the ignorance of the average American citizen, and truly wish you well in this endeavor. But I challenge you to scour the Federalist Papers, Hamilton, Jefferson, Madison, to find the word democracy anywhere. Thank you so very much, and you two take care. Have a great Thanksgiving and a Merry Christmas.
Who wants to take that on?
You're listening to Civics 101. I'm Nick Capodice.
I'm Hannah McCarthy.
And today in our podcast refresher course on the basics of how our democracy works, we're interrogating those exact words. Are we wrong to refer to the U.S. as a democracy? What did the framers of our Constitution intend for us to be? And while we're at it, how democratic are we anyways?
You know, the word democracy, of course, goes back to ancient Greece and to the city-states that first pioneered this form of politics.
This is Juliet Hooker.
I'm the Royce Professor of Teaching Excellence in Political Science at Brown University.
Now, when Juliet is talking about ancient Greece, is she referring to Athens, to Athenian democracy?
Yes, she is. This is the very first known democracy in human history.
In political theory and political science, we understand democracy as a form of government in which the people have the authority to rule, to deliberate and make decisions about policy, and they can do so directly. This is called direct democracy, right? In the Athenian city-states, they were small enough that it was direct.
The word democracy comes from demos, meaning people, and kratia, meaning power. Men who had undergone mandatory military training were obliged to participate in the assembly in Athens, where elected officials proposed laws and everybody voted by a show of hands.
Obliged, as in they had to vote.
Yeah, they had to. If they didn't, they could be fined and sometimes marked with red paint. And there was a whole set of rules about who could be one of those elected officials who proposed all the laws in the first place, which is fascinating, but I can't get into it all here. I do need to throw in some quick fun etymology, though. When they would vote on whether or not to expel someone who was dangerous to the country, they'd use broken pieces of pottery called ostracone to cast their ballot. And that is where we get the word ostracize.
I actually knew that, believe it or not.
I had a feeling you would.
All right, so I do want to get to America and its founding. But there is a bit of a problem here in Athens. We think about this being an example of pure democracy, direct democracy, but it was only men who could vote.
Yeah, absolutely. We are not including women when we talk about this democracy. We are not including enslaved Greeks. Roughly, only about 30% of the Athenian population could participate in the democratic process. So that's our starting point. And about 2,000 years later, 55 men were debating how to design the system we use in the U.S. today.
Certainly at the time of the founding, I think there has become something that people bat about in contemporary debates. The word that people often use was republic, because at that time, the issue was gaining independence. The idea was not to be part of this monarchical empire anymore, but to be a republic. But it is also the case, I think, there's certainly a question about that scholars of American political development have thought about whether, the extent to which, for example, the founders were committed to a vision of, let's say, equal democracy.
And, like in Athens, we weren't a truly inclusive democracy.
It was restricted, right? It didn't apply to everyone. Primarily in terms of who could participate fully as a citizen to propertied white men. So women were excluded, certainly until after the Civil War and emancipation and the amendments granting citizenship to Black men. Black people were excluded, indigenous people also. As a matter of law, up until the 1960s, the U.S. was not a full democracy because it was not really possible for African Americans to participate in the South. So even just as a matter of, just the basic functioning of democracy, up to what is it now? 60 years ago, the U.S. was not a full democracy.
Yeah, this is very important. There's sort of a sliding scale of democracy in America. We've constantly shifted who is allowed to participate in the political process.
Yes, as Juliet said, until 1790, it was only white men who owned property who could vote. And we think about the big laws or amendments that changed that, like the 15th and the 19th Amendment, or the Voting Rights Act of 1965. But throughout history, there were myriad laws that states passed with racial, religious, or gender restrictions explicitly prohibiting groups of Americans from voting.
Okay, we have talked about the history of the word democracy. Let's talk about the other one that Juliet mentioned, the Republic.
Yeah, so we're swapping out Hermes for Mercury and Poseidon for Neptune because we're going from Greece to Rome.
Is that your go-to Roman music bed?
Yep.
It's Roman all over the place.
Res publica, a system for the public. Now, at first blush, Hannah, the Roman Republic looks a lot like us. There's a democratic forum, and there's a senate, and officials representing the people, not the people themselves, make all the decisions. But the senators who wrote and passed all the laws were not elected. They were from the richest, most aristocratic families in Rome. And at the very top were two consuls, which the Senate elected.
Now, if the Senate and the consuls did all of the law passing, what was the purpose of the forum?
Well, the forum didn't have a lot of power. It was a place for speeches and elections of lower level offices. But honestly, the appointed Senate, they ran the whole thing.
So the forum was a placation tool.
Yeah, it's like, go talk about it in the forum.
Yeah.
And we, the Senate, who weren't even elected, will think about it real hard.
Okay, so we in America are a little like the Athenian democracy and a little like the Roman Republic. Nick, which of those words, democracy or republic, represents us better?
I will let you know the answer to this, Hannah, in my opinion, but more importantly, the opinions of the framers and our guests on the show.
Can we start with the framers? I mean, that former civics teacher who called into the Washington Journal challenged us to scour the texts of the framers to find the word democracy. Did you do that?
I did. First off, though, you know that famous exchange that may or may not have happened between Elizabeth Powell and Benjamin Franklin?
Is this the one where she said, "Well, doctor, what have we got, a republic or a monarchy?"
Greetings from Philadelphia. My name is Franklin, Benjamin Franklin. As I was coming out of the building one day, a woman said to me, "Sir, what have you given us?" And I looked at her and I said, "Madam, we have given you a republic if you can keep it."
And it's likely that he said that or something to that effect because it appears in the notes of James McHenry from the Constitutional Convention. However, another quote attributed to him is, quote, "Democracy is two wolves and a lamb deciding what to have for lunch." There is no evidence whatsoever that Franklin said that or anything like that. The first use of that quote that I could find was from 1990. And also, by the way, people didn't use the word lunch until the 19th century. But back to the main point. Did early political minds refer to democracy? If I do scour the founding documents for that word, will I find it? Yes, Hannah, they most certainly did.
Who did?
Well, here we go. In Federalist 14, James Madison used the word democracy 5 times, just in that essay alone. Now, to be fair, he was using the word to explain how the democratic republic is different from a quote-unquote pure democracy. He said that while direct democracy, the people making all the decisions, can be used in a small area, it cannot be used for a whole nation. John Adams used the expression representative democracy to describe our system. So too did Thomas Jefferson in 1815. And then we have 2 early Supreme Court justices. First, James Wilson, who helped write the Constitution. He said that there are 3 forms of government, quote, monarchical, aristocratical, and democratical, end quote. And later, Judge John Marshall,
The John Marshall,
the man himself, Justice Marshall, expounded on the maxims of democracy without ever even using the qualifier of representative before it. And I've been talking a lot about the Constitution here, Hannah, but we also have to mention that when we were getting started as a nation before the Constitutional Convention, we were even a little bit more democratic.
You know, it is thought that the Articles of Confederation were more small d democracy.
This is Paul Freimer. He's a professor of politics at Princeton University.
It was focused a little more populist, rooted in local governments. The 1780s were seen as a disaster, you know, in the various ways in which farmers and other groups avoided paying back debts and the like. It was thought to be generally chaotic. The government felt it needed more stability. And when you read something like Federalist 10 by James Madison, the tyranny of the majority and the belief that we need checks and balances, that was all to check democracy, to check broader populism, to put governance more in the hands of elites. That's pretty clear. They aren't all in agreement on that, but certainly the overall tone of the Constitution, the Federalist Papers, skews in that direction.
Just a fast refresher here. The Articles of Confederation was the name of our first governing document. It basically outlined 13 different countries, aka the colonies, with a very loose bond binding them together.
Right, a firm league of friendship. Almost no federal government, no chief executive, and, Hannah, they were a disaster. Rewriting the Articles was the initial goal of the Constitutional Convention.
And this goes back to the notion of a sliding scale of democracy, doesn't it? We started a little more democratic, and then we reined in the will of the people a little bit when we ratified the Constitution. Does Paul think that right now we can refer to America as a democracy?
Yeah, I think we aspire to be a democracy. That's important. We have enough procedures that require a certain form of democracy. Electoral college aside, the presidential election is largely a majority vote. That's meaningful. Most of our elections are majority elections. And we have procedures, civil liberties, due process. These are all important rights of democracy. Due process is a really critical one, that you can't just be thrown in jail without trial or some cause. Again, you can, we have political prisoners, we have huge incarceration rates. We can raise qualifications on all this, but there's an aspiration to a democracy, and I think there's enough procedures that we qualify to be a democracy.
I just want to pivot here. I'm so curious. How do we appear in the eyes of others, like people from other countries? Do others refer to the United States as a democracy?
They do indeed. We are on the list.
Oh, I know that list.
Yeah. No discussion of democratic principles would be possible without it. The Democracy Index. This is courtesy of the Economist Intelligence Unit. This index comes out every year. What it does is it ranks every country in the world on its democracy. It uses 60 indicators to measure where a country stands on the scale from full democracy all the way down to authoritarian regime. Paul told me that these indices aren't perfect. They came out after the Cold War. They are quite capitalist-driven, but people pay attention to them. And the most recent index at the time of this recording is from 2021.
How well did we do on that most recent one?
Not that well. The U.S. ranked 26th in the world when it comes to democracy, and we are in the category of, quote, flawed democracy. 31% of the world's countries are in that group.
Who is number one?
Norway, New Zealand, and Finland. It was a three-way tie with a perfect 10.
And then last place?
Afghanistan.
Now, 26th place for a country that regularly champions itself as being the ultimate democracy, right? That's kind of shabby. I mean, have we done better in the past?
We have. We are at a 7.85 out of 10 now. In 2006, we were at 8.66 out of 10. And this brings me to something Paul mentioned, a recent trend of people saying that we are becoming less democratic now than we were hundreds of years ago.
I'm often annoyed by some of the current discourse that the United States is less of a democracy today than we were, I don't know, I think since they first started doing these index tests going back to like the 1840s. And my response to that is that that's completely nonsense. What do we mean by a democracy? Obviously, we had slavery, we had Jim Crow, we had allowance of racial discrimination, legal racial discrimination until 1964 with the Civil Rights Act. Our political parties, so separating from that, our political parties hardly as democratic as they are today. 19th, early 20th century, you had party ballots where you received the ballot. It wasn't private. You had to vote for that party. A lot of times, the people stared at you when you requested a ballot. Parties were corrupt. We talk about the election outcomes. We have in history lots of examples of corruption. And that's not to say we're a great democracy now, but we really want to inquire what we mean. When have we ever really been a democracy? Maybe that'd be the question I'd ask.
If we're talking about democracy now in America, one of the factors we got to take into account is the Voting Rights Act of 1965, which outlawed voting laws and practices that discriminated against voters, black voters in particular, was, frankly, gutted in 2013 in the Supreme Court decision in Shelby v. Holder.
And at least for now, Jake, the bottom line is that these southern states, largely southern states that had these special requirements that the federal government imposed in that 1965 Voting Rights Act, they are no longer going to have to deal with that, at least for the time being, unless Congress takes special action. And as I said, I don't anticipate that special action anytime soon.
This was the Supreme Court ruling that places with a history of discrimination no longer need clearance from the federal government to change voting laws. And if you want to know more about it, we did a whole episode on the current state of the 1965 Voting Rights Act. I'm going to put a link to it in the show notes.
All right, Nick, so where does that leave us? How does our tagline fare? Are we a democracy?
Well, this answer is a two-parter. And in the first part, I want to say that I feel that it is fair to refer to the United States as a republic. And not because it was written into the Pledge of Allegiance over 100 years after the Constitution was ratified, that somebody put in there, and to the republic for which it stands. But I think it's fair because the U.S. is a republic. We elect people to write and pass laws. We don't do it ourselves all the time. And part two, it is absolutely fair to refer to the United States as a democracy. It's a representative democracy. We vote. We choose those officials, unlike in ancient Rome. And we even have vestiges of that pure democracy we talked about earlier. Lots of states have them. Initiatives, ballot measures, where the people can propose laws and vote on them. And from a very personal standpoint, I think that this "don't call us a democracy" rhetoric is nonsensical. It's meaningless. I read a quote about this the other day where someone said, it's like their toddler screaming, "The ball isn't green, it's round." We are a republic. We are a democracy. We've done better and we've done worse. But what's most important to me is something Juliet Hooker said when I asked her what to do when we feel that democracy is under threat.
I think maybe and this is not to minimize the current threats to democracy, which are very grave, but to say maybe it would be helpful if we recognize that democracy has always been under threat, because democracy isn't this thing that you achieve and then you're perfectly democratic and there's no work left to do. It's an ideal you're always trying to put into practice, right? It's a way of living in concert with others. Also, moving beyond a notion that there are only two sides to any issue and recognizing that there are multiple perspectives, and how do we reframe political and policy debate so that is recognized, and thinking about, why people have been disillusioned with democracy and why some people are also invested in it. So what are the sources of democratic faith? And also, why are the thinkers, movements, activists who also contest democracy? What are the things that it hasn't done well that lead people to despair?
I want to end this part of our discussion on the point that Juliet makes about moving beyond two sides of any issue, because that leads us right to what we're going to talk about next. When we come back, we're going to talk about our two-party system, because whether it's the best system or not, it's the one we've got. And that makes us ask this question: how does the two-party system compare to how political parties work in other countries? That's coming up right after the break.
He said that there are three forms of government, quote, monarchical, aristocratical, quote, monarchical, aristocratical, and democratical.
You watch enough political speeches, Hannah, and it gets to the point you don't even hear it anymore.
But don't let anyone tell you that America isn't great.
I think we have to get back to what this election has to be about, okay? This is the greatest country in the history of mankind.
We live in the greatest nation on earth. Thank Instead, I tell this story just to remind you of the magical, intoxicating power of America.
You're listening to Civics 101. I'm Nick Capodice.
I'm Hannah McCarthy.
And today we're asking how we measure up against the rest of the world. It seems, Hannah, every few weeks we come up with another series on our show, but this is one I desperately want to revisit. It's called Us Versus, or US Versus, where we compare other successful, or sometimes unsuccessful, governmental systems to our own. And today, something we get asked about constantly, the two-party system. Why do we have it? Can it change? And, most importantly, how does our system compare to other democracies? And yeah, I'm doing like a whole Street Fighter 2 thing. This is the opening music to that, by the way.
What is Street Fighter 2?
It's a violent lesson in democracy, Hannah. Players pick a fighter who lives in a country somewhere in the world, and they fly around the world visiting other countries and do battle with other fighters there.
So it's an arcade game.
It's an arcade game.
You win.
And right off the bat, I have to say, that is ridiculous. There is no M. Bison to defeat at the end of this episode. But I do want to say one thing, Hannah. It's a fast, personal anecdote. Did I ever tell you about the play that I was in New York that was really bad?
From what I understand, you're in a lot of really bad plays.
That's fair. This one was one of the worst, and I'm not going to name the director, but I was having a tough time in rehearsal one night because I didn't like any of the choices they were making. And I was upset, and a friend of mine said, Nick, no matter how bad you think a director is, they've got a better seat than you. And I'm never going to forget that.
Meaning you can't accurately critique your own performance because you're you.
Yeah.
So to take that lesson to heart for civics, it's hard to study American governmental systems when you're in them. You're basically on stage.
Right. So first I'm going to explain why we have a two-party system, but then we'll talk about the pros, cons, and how other democracies do it.
Hold on a second, Nick. I can hear the gathering of pitchforks. There are other parties in the United States.
There are many other parties. Keep your pitchforks in the barn. But I will say, Hannah, they make up an extremely small portion of elected officials. And, at least in our federal government, those representatives and senators that are members of a third party, almost always independent, tend to caucus with one party, either the Democrats or the Republicans, most of the time.
So, while there are other parties, we are known internationally as a country that has a two-party system.
Yeah, and to continue on that thread, to put us in the us versus frame of mind, I talked to a specialist in that, in comparative politics. Guillermo Rosas. He teaches at Washington University at St. Louis.
Comparative politics basically uses the comparative method to say meaningful things about politics in general. And here the emphasis is in using the domestic politics of different countries as data points, as observations that we can leverage to make general claims about political phenomena in general.
Guillermo told me that his students get very animated when he teaches the two-party system because they are frustrated.
It's not that they are apathetic, but they certainly feel alienated oftentimes, right? They see two options nowadays. It used to be that, because I'm old enough to have had students that are now in their 30s or 40s, there was a time when, people complained that the parties were too similar. So there was no real option.
When in modern history were the parties considered too similar?
After World War II, there was this era of political post-war consensus, where policy had very little to do with whether you had a D or an R next to your name. Most of the bills that passed in the 1950s and 60s were with bipartisan support. And voters expressed frustration with the fuzziness of the two parties. They didn't know who to hold accountable or what it was their representatives even stood for.
Now that's not a complaint, right? The complaint now is that there's certainly a lot of difference in the platforms of the Republican Party and the Democratic Party, but that they feel too far away from these parties, that they would like some other option that's closer to them. And that's a common complaint when you have a two-party system. It makes sense, right? Two parties, two options. And of course, these are parties that are going to have to pack a lot of content in their platforms.
This is something that I have heard not just from listeners to our show, but guests. I did an episode on independence, and one guest said she considered being an independent to be an act of non-compliance, a political statement of great importance.
Yeah, and I get that. We are at a moment right now of severe polarization. And if you told someone where you stood on a hot-button social issue, they could predict the probability of where you stand on 20 other issues that aren't even related to it.
So you're saying there's frustration when the two parties are too similar and also when they are too different. Then why do we have it? Is the two-party system in the Constitution?
Yeah, that's a really good question. It is not enshrined anywhere in our founding documents.
This is Robin Best, professor of political science at Binghamton University, who also teaches comparative politics.
And in fact, there's nothing in the Constitution that says that we have to have either a particular type of electoral system or a particular type of party system. The primary reason why we have a two-party system in the United States is the electoral system that we use for many of our elections and almost all of our national level elections, which is the single-member district plurality method of election.
So I think many of our listeners know how we do elections in America, but they might not be familiar with that term. Can we define it?
Yeah, single-member district plurality method of election, SMP for short, also called first-past-the-post voting. It's a winner-take-all system. It's just how we do it. You live in a geographic district, and in that district, you vote for one elected official, like a senator, congressperson, and the winner is the person with a plurality of votes. We can't say majority because there are usually more than two people on the ticket. It's usually a plurality. So say the first place gets 40% of the votes, second place gets 30%, and the rest of the votes go to other candidates.
So whoever wins that district, whichever candidate wins that district, wins the seat, and the loser gets absolutely nothing. And what this does is it really focuses political competition between two candidates, but also two political parties. So one political party could conceivably win the district seat, and then there's a political party that kind of comes in second and might be able to overtake the winner the next time around.
But this leaves those parties that came in third or fourth with little to no chance of winning over time.
And is this why you see candidates leave third parties and join one of these big two?
Yeah. I mean, if you're losing over and over as a Green Party or a Libertarian candidate, chances are you might change your affiliation to a D or an R so you got a chance. And the same goes for voters, Hannah. If a voter keeps voting for that third party and they never win anything in this winner-take-all system, they too will start to align with the red or the blue. And it's this combination of systems that creates a law.
What is the law?
Duverger's law.
Duverger is very celebrated, and with good reason, as having come up with a statement that, for political scientists basically has the force of law.
This is one of the closest things we have to a law in political science is Duverger's law. So this was Maurice Duverger, who expressed this relationship between a single-member district plurality method of election and a two-party system. So Duverger's law is very simply that the single-member district plurality method of election tends to favor a two-party system.
That is the law. Are we not men?
And it's for precisely the reasons that we've been discussing. So Duverger himself separated the process here into a mechanical effects and then a set of psychological effects.
That law says as long as we have winner-take-all single district plurality voting, it's a pretty sure bet that we'll be in a two-party system.
But that's not to say that we're going to forever be Democrats and Republicans. We have had a lot of parties over the years.
Oh, we sure have. Should we go through the list just for old time's sake?
Maybe we should get you a button that you press that just does classical music and a carriage running down a cobbled street, because it would save you a lot of time.
It's true. George Washington was our only president who wasn't aligned with a party. He hated parties. That man saw a balloon on a mailbox, he would drive right by. He would see them start to form during his administration. But in his farewell address, he excoriated parties. He said the spirit of parties, quote, serves always to distract the public councils and enfeeble the public administration. It agitates the community with ill-founded jealousies and false alarms, kindles the animosity of one part against another, foments occasionally riot and insurrection. But they happened right away. We started with the Federalists, led by Alexander Hamilton, and the Anti-Federalists, led by James Madison and Thomas Jefferson. The Anti-Federalists start to go by the Democratic Republicans, the Federalists die out around the War of 1812, and the Whigs rise to take their place. The Andrew Jackson-led Democrats come to contend against the Whigs. The Republican Party branches off the Whigs and grows into power to battle the Democrats, and from 1854 to now, it has been two parties, Republicans and Democrats.
And I have to add, what those parties stood for changed an awful lot over 150 years. We've done episodes on the Republican Party and the Democratic Party if anyone out there wants the full story on realignment. But I can't help but wonder, is there a possibility of fulfilling George Washington's fantasy? Can we exist without parties at all?
It seems improbable. Guillermo told me about a famed political scientist named Erich Elmer Schatzschneider, who said that contemporary representative democracy is really not even imaginable in the absence of parties.
Why?
Let me see if I can encapsulate this in a 1-minute elevator pitch. I may fail. But the best explanation is that once you have representatives in Congress, you are selecting people that come from geographically circumscribed territories. So there is in principle no reason why people that show up in Congress or in Parliament the first time have some sort of pre-built allegiance to a particular party, right? However, once they show up, they realize that they are going to be there for a while, right? Their terms vary from 2 years to 3, 4, whenever the next election is, and that they are going to have to be passing laws and building coalitions.
And if you want to succeed, if you want to get laws passed that your constituents love, and don't forget, if you want someone to bankroll your campaign, you align with one of these coalitions. You may not agree with them all the time, but you do most of the time.
The dirty secret is that politicians themselves know that they are tying their hands when they enter into a party, right? They are tying their hands and they are oftentimes called to do things that they do not necessarily believe are in their best personal interest. But they trade this off for the opportunity or for the predictability of belonging to a coalition that they understand.
Parties in politics, two parties in America. They are here and they're here to stay. But is that a good thing or a bad thing?
Well, we'll talk about that as well as how we measure up to other countries right after the break.
But first, if you want to read about how the parties changed as part of a complete primer on how America works, check out our book, A User's Guide to Democracy. It has got the 101 on everything and is peppered with wonderful cartoons by New Yorker cartoonist Tom Toro.
Also, we got a fun, goofy, free newsletter called Extra Credit. Let us say hello in your email every 2 weeks and tell you about the stuff we cut out from our episodes. Subscribe at civics101podcast.org. We're back. This is Civics 101 from New Hampshire Public Radio, and we're talking about our two-party system in the United States. We've established that even if the parties themselves change, our current method of electing people through a winner-take-all election system means that our two-party system probably won't change anytime soon.
Okay, now to the U.S. versus. Do any other countries have a system like ours?
Here's Robin Best again.
It's really fun to teach American students about comparative politics because you learn how weird the U.S. is. The U.S. is actually really strange and unique on a number of dimensions. And the two-party system is actually, in this day and age, quite rare as well.
There are a few countries that have a system where the same two parties are vying for seats like us, notably Jamaica, the Bahamas, and Zimbabwe. And there are other countries that vote like we do, but don't have a two-party system.
Some of the other countries that use single-member district plurality elections, like Canada or the United Kingdom, They have very significant third parties that manage to enter their national legislatures, and we just don't. And one of the reasons why you might think that's the case is you might say that instead of 2 parties, we actually have 100.
And here is where we are truly one of a kind. Political parties in the U.S. are organized on a state-by-state basis.
So you could think of the U.S. as having like a New York State Democratic Party and then a Texas Democratic Party, or a New Hampshire Republican Party and a Colorado Republican Party, and that you actually get some ideological and strategic differences between the party organizations by state. So the U.S. is actually quite unique in the structure of its party system, not only because it's a 2-party system, but again, because these parties are they're very large, they're umbrella parties. And because of that, they can mask a lot of underlying variations, a lot of which take place at the state level.
If the 2 parties are umbrellas, each encapsulating 50 state parties, I can see true federalism at work. A country where people are frustrated that their Democrat or Republican Party isn't necessarily repped at the federal level.
That's a good point.
So let's get into it. Give me a country that does it differently.
You got it. Here is Guillermo Rosas again with Germany.
In Germany, there probably are 5 to 6 parties represented in the Bundestag.
Germany has a multi-party system. They are a federal parliamentary representative democratic republic. The Bundestag, which he mentioned, is their federal parliament, and members of it are elected by the German people. There are 736 seats in the Bundestag, indeed divided by 6 parties.
So in principle, there's something for everyone, right? You can feel very close to a particular party. But it is not entirely obvious to voters what kind of governing arrangement they are going to get after all of the bargaining is done once the election has taken place.
And that's not the case in the U.S. Sure, we have moderates and far left and far right politicians, but they're all aligned under a majority umbrella. In contrast, when you have a lot of parties, something for everyone, and there's no clear majority, how is anyone going to get legislation passed? Only through working with other parties. Sure, I'll sign your clean energy bill, but only if you add X, Y, and Z, and then you sign my bill, which maybe your constituents are going to hate.
So the trade-off here is that you can elect someone who lines up exactly with what you want, a member of your very specific party, but you have no idea if they're going to succeed at getting anything done.
And the corollary of that is that it's also going to be more difficult for you as a voter to know exactly whom you need to hold accountable for things that you dislike.
Okay, that's an example of a multi-party system. Is there such a thing as a one-party system?
Most one-party systems occur in countries that are not democratic, right? So China is a one-party system. Cuba is a one-party system. Vietnam is a one-party system. There are other systems, more and more so. In political science, we're moving away from a strict dichotomous division between authoritarian countries and democratic countries. Think about the united Russia in Putin's Russia, right? That would also be a competitive authoritarian regime where other parties can obtain representation in the Duma, but it's a pretty hegemonic presence of the main party.
Okay, we're not going to get into the pros and cons of non-democratic or authoritarian systems in this episode, but I will say, it's pretty effective.
Yeah, it's easy to get stuff done if you just do away with elections and democracy and representatives. A lot less gridlock.
I think I understand the pros and cons of two-party versus multi-party. Two-party systems like ours are relatively easier to govern. One party is in power for a while, and they can get laws passed until the other party wins control. And the downside is a lack of choices. You've got two ways to address every issue in America. And multi-party systems offer more diversity of thought, but have more trouble passing laws. And there's less accountability.
That's a pretty good summation, and I think Guillermo and Robin would both be proud of it.
I bet Guillermo wouldn't say being a political scientist and all, but did he give any hint of what he thinks is the best of these democratic systems? Is there one that surpasses all others as champion?
Many students, especially the young ones, believe that somewhere out there is a perfect political system that has the right amount of parties, that has the right configuration to allow laws to be passed effectively and implemented with some good sense. And it is true that I think some systems are better than others, but that's a holy grail, right? I mean, it's, it's not a search that will have a clear final goal where you're going to find the perfect system.
And I dared ask him, Guillermo, I know there isn't a perfect system, but if you had to pick, which country do political scientists think is closest to that holy grail?
Did he choose one?
He did.
What was it?
Spain.
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 Spain would be kind of the place that people have in mind. And you know, if you have been following politics in Spain, it's anything but placid, right? There's also a lot of problems. It's complicated. But the argument there would be that the way that Spanish voters send representatives to the Cortes, to their parliament, is that they are also divided geographically.
I'm going to try to break down how Spain does it, and I hope we don't make a hash of things. But Spain is divided into 50 provinces, and each province elects members to Spain's Congress, called the General Courts. The more people that live in a province, the more seats it sends to the courts.
It sounds a lot like our own congressional district.
Yes, but with two massive differences. They do not use the SMP winner-take-all method. They use a proportional method, and the people don't vote for individuals. They vote for a party that has a pre-selected list of candidates. As an example, let's take Cadiz, that old town on the southwestern coast. Cadiz sends 9 people to the courts. In their 2019 election, the Spanish Socialist Workers' Party got 30% of the vote and thus won 3 seats. The conservative Vox Party got 20% and they sent 2 people to the courts, and so on.
So what does that buy you? It buys you, in terms of the alienation that we've been talking about, it buys you the fact that you have more parties with more diverse platforms all over the spectrum from far left to far right that you can choose from. So that's nice. At the same time, you are not fragmenting the assembly or the parliament all that much. After all, there's only so many ways in which you can divide 8 votes, right? Even you have 40 parties competing, most of them are not going to get a lot of representation.
Some political scientists say that Spain's system hits that sweet spot,
in which you are obtaining some of the advantages of a system like the United States, where you know who your Congress representative is, where you know the Congress representative spends a lot of time in close to the constituents, develops a home style, wants to kiss babies and shake hands and talk to people and all of that. And the advantages of the more proportional systems that we tend to find in continental Europe, where there is more possibility for different interests to be represented.
All right, my last question is, how do we measure up? Who wins in this us versus?
Now, I am not saying, if we want to go back to the Street Fighter 2 reference at the beginning, that we should all choose Vega instead of Guile.
I think maybe 1% of our audience is going to get that reference.
Fair. That's fair. Guile is from the US, everyone. Vega is from Spain. But Spain is by no means a consensual nation politically. They've got divides and problems like we all have divides and problems. But to know how the US would do in a comparative matchup against Spain, Guillermo said, we can't. We have to wait and see.
You know, the American two-party system has its problems. I'm not going to stand here and say otherwise. But it also, what I like about it is that it provides ample opportunity to build relatively lasting majority coalitions. I think we're going through a period in American history in which this is not quite working out, because we seem to be in the middle of a process of realignment where the 2 big parties are trying to figure out how they are going to capture constituencies that they didn't used to represent. And I think it's going to take a while for the parties to sort this out. But I like the two-party system because of that, right? It especially in a country that's as heterogeneous as the United States.
And in this liminal space of a realignment, the two big parties are looking to their constituents and deciding what their new platforms are, what the party stands for. And once we get through this phase of what Guillermo referred to me as growing pains, only then can we better assess how we measure up on a global scale.
All right, until then, I'm sticking to Tekken.
Well, that'll just about do it for a two-party party, because a two-party party is a party I like. Today's episode was produced by me, Nick Capodice, with Hannah McCarthy. Our senior producer is Christina Phillips. Rebecca Lavoie is our executive producer.
For all of the educators out there, Civics 101 has lesson plans and teaching resources that you can download and use in your classroom for free. Find those resources and all of our episodes at civics101podcast.org. Civics 101 is a production of New Hampshire Public Radio.